the first project I'm presenting is the Agency of Environmental Migration, Amending Archive for People and Landscapes in Flux, which is a half GIS mapping and half website that I was working on with some group of people in school. And what we did was trace the fibers of plants and migrating animals to create an non-hierarchical recording archive of environmental shifts in the globe. And I was fortunate to work with these classmates, so I'll try my best to represent them in this explanation of the project. We were taking the idea of survivalism as a way to record the voice of the public sphere for everyday activism and showing both human and animal agents through this website platform. So our mission with this agency was to build an open source digital archive of storytelling and the changing landscapes related to climate migration across North America. But the bigger hope is to expand it beyond North America and do the entire globe. And we did start to do that with some GIS mapping tools, which I'll get into in a little bit. And the reason why we were working on this project for this class was because we noticed how it was very difficult to claim a refugee status based on any displacement related to climate issues. So in order to qualify for refugee status, you had to prove that the climate-related disaster had some form of violence or some form of like crime related to it. So we wanted to do this advocacy project to encourage policymakers and also educators to be more like proactive with realizing that these environmental stories are not just data points, but also related to like personal stories and archives. So we developed a few keywords to talk about the natural disasters, heat, melt, swell, drought, congest, and leak. And we began to map some of these stories on GIS, and these blue lines are hurricane routes cutting through the sea here, and the data points are a beta version of stories that we collected through interviews with displaced people that were willing to share their stories with us. And hope that this video will play. This is a beta version of what our website looks like. So on the front page, you get all these animal icons that you click into, which leads you into a specific region. So in this case, we were looking at the Arctic region and caribou migration and how the sinew of those leathers carried stories. And then when you go back and click on these points, we create this textile of like collected stories that you could look into, and it has a species tag to it. And then you can also look at the migration path. And then in the storytelling, this is where we collect the stories. So there was an option to record something and upload it. And we always made sure to alter the voice of the recordings to keep the stories anonymous if the contributors wanted them to be. This is playing again. I think I need to skip to the next page. Yeah. So this is a back end of what we were doing. So we used the Harvard CGA ArcGIS tool to create the spinning globe, and this was believe the feature scene in the ArcGIS. And was surprised to find that there was really like a ton of data available that I can just plug in and download here. And I also was surprised by the design features. So the customability was very high, and I didn't even have, I was able to work on it with my Mac, and I didn't need my PC to do all the visualizations, and I was able to do it all online. And I got a lot of help from Bruce Wusek, which I know he also talked to us in a workshop. And he basically gave us a lot of tips on like what kind of format we needed to plot the stories in. And then the next step we're trying to take is like to take this live. And it's kind of slowing down the website. So we're trying to figure out like a ways to minimize the design so that the stories will be the main focus of the website. And then jumping into a second project, this was a recipe book engagement project with a tribal council, Gwich'in community in Northwest Territories of Canada. And I was working on this with my classmate Chien, and we were interested in food sovereignty in the Arctic region. There's been a lot of highway building in the area, which has caused a lot of like climate degradation. And we partnered up with Gwich'in Social and Cultural Institute. And they were really great and helpful because they already have this kind of website where they're hoping to engage with researchers and students. So they have like the framework to and the resources to talk to us. And their website has like these oral maps, images, reports of plants documented in the region. So we reached out and we met with the Cultural and Heritage Coordinator, Sharon and Arlen, Christy, which was the GIS specialist, and we were partnering up to document more plants and animals through mapping in the area. And for context, this was part of a landscape architecture studio. However, like both of us felt like we didn't need to bring more design into the space. What we felt like we could contribute was like the graphic side of things and contribute the tools for the mapping. So the project was to advocate for like local food systems and prioritize traditional recipes. And we started by looking at some of the food prices in the area. So these are really just insane prices, like $35 for a jug of orange juice. And all this food was imported through the Dempster Highway. And all the food was traveling really long distances to get to the Arctic. So that's why the prices were so high. And in response to that, we wanted to map what the local food sources were. So you can see we were looking in the city of Inuvik, but this whole region is just abundant with a lot of wildlife, a lot of caribou and plants that were traditionally used in their recipes. And all of these animal ranges, go beyond the political boundaries of what the site was. So we were trying to together understand like what existing resources there are to move beyond like an imported food system. And yeah, so through mapping, we mapped the history of the expansion of the highway. What's really interesting is that Dempster Highway is literally named after a police officer. There's a ton of colonial violence in this region through the construction of the highway and then the disrupted pathways. So we wanted to see all the kinds of existing resources that were available in terms of food. So one was this traditional knowledge along this Fort McPherson Mackenzie Bay River. All of these points are fishing camps used by elders seasonally for fishing. And it was important to map these, then maybe put them on the tribal website so that you could like click into them and then it would bring you to a story or like an anecdote about like how these camps were used today. Yeah, and then there's a close-up of that Mackenzie Bay and then the fishing camps and the main types of fish that are found in the area. And we wanted to together propose going back to at least preserving or understanding how we could continue to hunt from the land and take food from the land. So that also included a study of the seasonality, and it's very interesting to find that instead of 4 seasons, they typically see the seasons as 5, divided into 5 seasons. So there's the spring, summer, fall, and then also the breakup season, which is when the ice starts to break up and it becomes warmer and before spring arrives. So all these circles are representing like the passage of time and then the types of fish and animals that emerge, and then the plate in the middle is like a representative traditional dish of what's available. And then we also together did outreach through this open call for food photos. We asked community members from the Gwich'in Tribal Council to submit home-cooked food pictures. And we were able then to use these pictures as references for the cookbook that we worked on. So together we created this cookbook of traditional recipes, and these recipes were given to us by the tribal council. They've had these for years, but it's never been like put online and it's not been visual. It was just like a Word document. And it was really fun to put this together as like a resource for the tribal website. And it was divided into seasons. So for example, winter, the most common animals you'd see would be like caribou, rabbit, types of fish, and baked goods. And we did like illustrations of these, as well as quotes from the website, and then instructions of how to recreate the dish. And then we also played around a lot with the representation of the food, and we ended up going with a more abstract representation, just because like some of the recipes, I think the thing about food is there's no like one way of representing what that dish looks like, and we wanted to go with like a more like interpretive kind of representation. But then some of these photographs, we also just put them into the book. So there's like a mixture of illustration, drawings, and photographs. Yeah, and then the next step with them would be to send these books over by mail, and then we want to implement some of these maps, the earlier maps of the migrational paths, onto the website. And yeah, I think that's about 15 minutes. I'll stop there. Thank you.
It's awesome. Completely fascinating topics, really remarkable ways to engage with the community. I love cookbooks as a way, a mechanism for doing that, and beautiful designs and graphics.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's so nice to see the work. I've seen snippets of it, so it's nice to see the full piece, and also yeah, to imagine where you're taking it. is exciting. I was also interested in this season, so it's kind of interesting. I thought actually that you were going to say there were going to be more than 5 seasons, but I appreciate, I guess, the different modes, the kind of listening, the time aspect, the types of drawings, all of those things seem to come together so like effortlessly, which I'm sure was not the case, but it's nice to see.
Yeah, I think I showed these because I thought maybe they're like most relevant to how to put together like a website or kind of coherent design language for like the research in some way that would engage the community. So yeah, and I'd be happy to share like the online GIS mapping resources through Slack as well.
Awesome. Questions? Comments?
I have a comment. The first images we're talking about, storm trajectory and mapping out the regions. I didn't see PR highlighted very much, so I'm like, hey, where's PR? I'm just joking. No, great, amazing work. I just, if you wanna gain if there's an opportunity to add perhaps more perspectives on experiences, being in the Caribbean and dealing with extreme events, storms, and storm events exacerbated by climate. I can point you into the direction of some friends, or I can share about my stories. I've been there for most of my life, so, or I have a couple of things to share.
Yeah, that would be really incredible. I think one of our biggest challenges is finding people who are willing to contribute a story, because I mean, we're still students, so it's like, where's the reciprocity of like, if they're contributing something, what can we give back to them? So there has to always be like, something impactful that we can directly give back. So that's why it's like hard to gather those stories. So if there are any like ways you think we can frame like the outreach, that would be really helpful.
I mean, so I was doing response relief work and I was living in PR when Hurricane Maria hit, and it's things you aren't necessarily thinking about for an event like that, but all of a sudden you're risking your life and in ways that you're not aware of and ways that you're definitely aware of. And when you're in that situation, you're like, oh, so this is this is actually happening right now. And, so that all of a sudden that whole experience of just dealing with all of that is overwhelming. I'm happy to share if that's of interest, and in terms of reciprocity, I'm happy with, if you decide to pay it forward, it's not something that you have to pay back, but just whatever. Think about it and you share.
Thank you.
All right, I think I'm next in alphabetical order, right? I can still alphabetize, I think, right? Okay,
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks. I am going to just, I guess, share my screen. And all right, cool. Well, it's great to be here. I'm just going to talk a little bit, I guess, about broadly what I do, and like Diana showed, two kind of works in process that are portals. I will say, as a kind of disclaimer, a lot of the work that I do is around teaching and teaching future landscape architects. So I feel like a lot of the content is generated with the idea of teaching people how to think perhaps differently about landscape and landscape architecture and what it can do. So it's a little bit about I think changing narratives in maybe two directions. One, to kind of understand that things don't, especially around abandoned land, things don't just happen, that they're very kind of deliberately constructed through really unjust practices. But at the same time, I think it's, you want to see, I guess, the potential in things too. And so it's nice to be a landscape architect in that regards, because you can be sort of forward thinking, imagining, what we could do, what could be the potential. So sort of seeing the desire in things while understanding the kind of deep-seated damage that's behind them. It's work that I began in Philadelphia. I went to grad school there. And I went to grad school at the time where there was a mayor. John Street was the mayor, and he was actively demolishing and clearing land. It was called Neighborhood Transition Initiative. And the idea was really that you have all of this abandonment tends to be a kind of, while it's very deliberately constructed, a kind of unplanned condition in a sort of city planning sense. So you have land that has pockets, or that there's, and so the idea was like, well, what if we clear it? We could actually invite development in. And so this is an area in North Central Philly, just north of Girard College, that I spent a lot of time in and thinking about, and imagining what perhaps could be alternatives to what seemed like the two modes forward at that particular time, one of which was to clear it and invite development in, and one of which was to kind of not know what to do with it and just leave it as is and not sort of invest in its social or ecological potential. And so this is two sides of the same street. And it seems like where is the kind of middle ground, or what is the possibility in between? And I think I've been sort of thinking about this question ever since, and I claim to have zero answers to the question. It's only gotten sort of more complex as you understand the political and economic conditions and the racial interest in conditions and injustices around it, but also more sort of urgent as we think about the climate. And so the reason I think about it as kind of past, present, and future is I was looking at Philadelphia, which and other cities in the Midwest in which abandonment has been happening forever, really. But it's a present condition. And I think, if anything, as we migrate, as we think about places we might be moving to or leaving behind, it's going to be a future condition. So I'm really interested in how we can do things differently as we, quote unquote, abandon more land moving forward. And so I started basically just, I also grew up in Portland, and I barely flew. So I've driven around a lot. And I sort of enjoy finding things and meeting people and seeing what could be on the ground. So how could you sort of gather different images around things that are happening, and how could you kind of celebrate a social and ecological potential around these lands? And how could you think about it, maybe not as abandonment, but as a kind of pause, like you do. So the reason I kind of call the work From Fallow is that you're sort of imagining this as a condition like in agriculture, where something is resting so that it could become better soil in the future, rather than thinking about the past. And then I show these two books because they're sort of parallel projects. I'm actually going to just show the From Fallow one because I think it's more relevant to this, but it's sort of thinking about gathering all these places. I think of it as a kind of love letter to the American landscape of driving around and meeting people and seeing what they're doing and imagining what the possibilities could be, framing them as actions, kind of understanding that vacancy is not one condition. So this is going to go really fast, but drawing out, often you see like the vacant lot 150 by 100 parcel, but actually it's a myriad of conditions with all sorts of potentials. And so these are drawings that are inspired by things that people are doing. They are not necessarily in situ spaces, but allowing you to kind of imagine, dream, think about what the potential could be. And in a way, the other project is about telling longer stories. So instead of framing something between 1940 when it looks like X and 2020 when it looks like Y, imagining a much longer history around land, or taking it all the way back to its pre-colonial measures, so that you're not really thinking about it in this fixed way, and you're kind of imagining the ways in which land can transform. So in a way, it's a collection of ideas. And it's kind of, I guess, focused on the Northeast and the Midwest, although I think some of the ideas come from traveling all sorts of other places, both here and abroad. And these are just some of the drawings. So each piece has a text. I actually wrote the text first, which is not the usual method that I use, and kind of imagined through that text drawings. And they're sort of thinking about the different scales that things can happen, the different configurations, the relationships between fabric. But in a way, and then there's this kind of index of imagining what might be the time that something could last, what might be its cost, how much labor would be involved, how much maintenance, what type of environment would you kind of need, not to sort of, I guess, to highlight the ecological and social engagement that could happen. And so I show that it ended up in a book form. I also kind of exhibited it at the school. And the idea here was sort of, I think fences make people uncomfortable, but I think that fences are something that underlie this work and that we should sort of talk about. So the structure of the exhibit are fence posts that are spaced relative to the categories and the ideas, and the drawings are kind of layered on. It allowed me to make some physical things, some visual things, some animated things. And this is from the afterword. And so it's like a question of what next. So in a way, I think all projects are ongoing. So maybe the book is done, but I think the work is obviously not done at all. So it's a question of like, not perhaps just changing the narrative or investing in new frameworks, but actually thinking about how you might get things done, which is, I think, something that you are all much more well-versed in than me. But I think I'm trying to think about ways to make the work more grounded and more relevant. And so to me, those are kind of gerunds. I think the design communities tend to not be the best at listening, observing, partnering. We are decent at imagining. So how do we actually change the way in which we engage with people and projects and processes? How do we imagine seeding wealth back into communities, developing ideas around co-governance, and how do we kind of think about things not in terms, and this is maybe too much into my own politics, but not in terms of framing them as capital. And so what would it mean if we are thinking about reproductive models together? What were we thinking about labor instead of modes of ownership? It wouldn't be sort of nature's capital. We're not trying to quantify what other systems might do in terms of capital, but in terms of other frames. So in terms of labor, in terms of care, in terms of things that might invest back into our shared communities. And then, like Diana, although not as smart as Diana, I didn't record anything. So you're going to watch me fumble around in these portals. I'm going to show you two. You're welcome to look at these more in depth. They're both kind of on a public platform, but I just wanted to give you a sense of like how this work then started to be organized into a website or into a portal. So one is around this kind of land banks, questions of abandonment, and the other one is around more models related to climate. It's from a different set of work, but I thought it would be interesting to see those two. So bear with me while I sort of fumble around. And also when you share your screen, you can't actually see your screen. So there's that. But I think I'm still sharing, right, this website. So this is the kind of, From Fallow, I actually built it as a website for a course, but also for me, a kind of personal way of thinking about the research. So thinking about lenses around abandonment. So keywords is something that I think is somewhat helpful. You can click on them, you'll start to get resources related to them. There's also resources pages where you can choose to listen, to watch, to read, to browse with different types of material that's publicly available and is kind of aggregated as a way to kind of think through it. And then there's work that I've sort of done that comes along with it. As I said, I like to think about long histories. And so sort of thinking about the different kind of political, economic, and sort of environmental lenses to these. What are key things that have happened? Also creating series of maps. I became increasingly more interested in real estate and speculation, and how the real estate industry is basically producing these conditions. So for instance, in this particular map. These are maps that are generated through GIS, but there's post-processing in a kind of Adobe suite. But here looking at private property that's owned as part of a portfolio of 10 parcels, kind of looking at where demolition is happening. So for instance, this is St. Louis. It may have abandoned property all over, but it's striking when you start to map demolition, when you start to map taken by the city, it then tends to be aggregated in certain neighborhoods. When you start to do painful searches around who owns property to find out that there's all this kind of aggregation of property that's happening, which then there's a series of atlases that way. I did start to look at then at episodes, like how you might, these are not GIS story maps, but they could be analogous, how you might tell the story of a particular site and neighborhood, kind of to understand it through different images and time, how it came to be kind of constructed, so that, you know, when you see houses subsiding or you see certain conditions, it's actually this kind of produced history. To sort of understand that, I'm not a real estate expert by any means, but I think I'm sort of thinking about it through the lens. So then also making kind of primers to sort of understand, if you're a landscape architect, what is real estate? What is the housing cycle? How could you own property? How can you sort of sit on it? Things like that. And so it's just a different ways of kind of aggregating work with different modes and media. And then the other portal I wanted to share is a portal that I built for a course that I taught around that I think maybe Diana didn't take, but Sophie definitely did, around climate issues and what design might be able to, how design might be able to act. But I just wanted to show you, there's sort of interactive maps within this. We could zoom into to Puerto Rico, looking at different types of projects, different paradigms around engagement, different themes in that way. So that's a kind of interactive map that aggregates both kind of themes, some of these flat maps, it might be that we made around looking at hurricane paths, at sea temperature rise, sorry, it's flipping through, and then where GDP is kind of concentrated, or looking at inland flooding issues, looking at questions related to forest cover and drought, soils and soil subsidence. So creating this kind of atlas of risk around different types of climate issues. And then that map then also looks at case studies that we are starting. And maybe this is also how this is a work in progress. So I feel like I have a very limited frame and set of references. So these are projects that engage to some degree with climate adaptation or mitigation. And then we have some kind of resources around those, and some of which we developed a little bit, maybe in further detail, kind of understanding how different places are addressing things, and to take a critical lens on them. So to understand what is working, what is not necessarily working. So I can put the URLs in the chat, but you're welcome to ask me any questions or browse around or give me feedback, suggest projects, all of those things. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say around this is, since I think landscape architects are generalists and not necessarily experts on anything. The other thing is thinking about topics related to some of these issues, let's say designing for uncertainty. And this is also building in progress. Some videos, I've been doing interviews with people who are doing, talking about it, aggregating different types of reading. And I think it was sort of more curated as it set for a class, but now that it's maybe could become an open and more public resource, I could add more to all of these spaces. That's that. I think that's all I will say. Oh, I just wanted to say thank you. And also I am giving a talk on August 11th on the other book. So on looking at the more longer histories and ways of framing cities. But thank you.
You're in Philly, right?
I'm giving it remotely. I am actually in Philly that day, but the lecture is remote. So it just happens to be that I'm in Philly, but it's at the Athenaeum. So.
So this is awesome. I've seen some of these sites before, but I have a much better understanding from your presentation. I have one question for you. Could you say a little bit about the data sources you use, especially for the second project, and also what tools you use to build the websites?
Sure. The data sources. Yeah, I mean, global data sources are a little bit tricky. I have the data sources for them. For the second site, the maps are basically through various NOAA data. I mean, there's a lot of data sets through GIS basically into them. For the interactive, we used Mapbox. I think it's a little bit glitchy, honestly, but we used Mapbox to create the kind of interactive map piece of it. Actually inspired by another project by Mio Mazare, who is at MIT, who does a lot of great work around climate issues. You had me. Oh, in terms of the websites themselves, they're built through Cargo, which is just a basic, I guess, a template. Since we're design, I guess I like the possible templates. One of them was built starting with a template. One of them was not built starting with a template. I think I don't code, so the coding is relatively easy and the support is pretty good. So they're just built through a kind of public website in that way. I tend to just try things and do them, and maybe I am also surrounded with, I should say there's a large team involved in that. You should click on the team page, surrounded by people who do that. So I don't know if I'm espousing to the like best methods for that kind of thing. But yeah. But I do have the data sources if specifically you're interested in, like, I don't know that I could rattle off in terms of like, where does the sea surface temperature come from? Where does the, but they are mostly government generated data sets. Brought through GIS, some of which, I mean, and then for the other project, like I guess I'm much more familiar with the kind of property data sets, and they are at the municipal level and through assessors data, and some of which is already capable of being spatialized, others of which goes through Excel and is sorted in various ways to make it work with GIS.
So since you mentioned Philly, and when you studied Philly, when you started looking at abandonment and landscapes, so my just took me to think about my previous work that I did here in Philly, and thinking that the city it's working to implement its Green City Green Waters initiative, which is very interesting because it's like the nation's first municipal plan that prioritizes nature-based solutions in the form of green stormwater infrastructure to manage stormwater and meet urban urban water quality compliance, because most of like old cities have just combined sewer systems, so it's just big. For folks that don't know what combined sewer is, it's like just underground pipe in which stormwater and sewer water is combined. When you combine stormwater with sewer water, it's sewer water. So that's significantly contaminating all of our water bodies and rivers. So Philly is the first city in the country that said, we're going to use green stormwater infrastructure to manage most, or at least the first 2 inches of rain. That means that they need to install, GSI to manage 2/3 of the entire city area. And I worked, the nonprofit that was implementing projects in support of that, and the idea of managing 2/3 of the city, and the amount of GSI systems that you have to install is significant. It has a very it could have a very unique impact into what the overall landscape could look like, especially because what the city is pursuing is not doing retrofits on the right of way, meaning sidewalks and streets, but doing it on privately owned land. So every property you try to manage on site, try to prevent the stormwater runoff to get to the right of way, and it was a headache. But when you think about the ambitions of the plan, but the importance of being successful, is like the city begins to look differently. So it means backyard, front yard, on the roof, everywhere that you can put a system to capture stormwater, and you can see them because they need to be, they become part of the landscape because you have to do so many. And just thinking about how that, with all the technical needs of space, of slope and configurations to actually capture stormwater runoff, how does that compete with the need of developers for developing and making money, the need for the city to be developer friendly city because it's a poor city and it depends on the taxing and the fees that it comes from development to sustain its public finances. So a lot of competing things that on papers, you don't know how necessarily they go well together, but definitely will have a significant impact on the landscape, once there's more advancements. So just thought about that.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's it's something that and actually the Philadelphia chapter does focus on questions of hydrology and makes this a similar, I guess, it highlights similar things. It also argues in some ways that like Philly has made choices throughout its history that have been involved in investing in its local landscape. So for instance, when New York and Boston decided to go for clean water way upstream and flood towns and dispossess things, Philly is still taking its drinking water from its rivers. I think they are maybe not sometimes decisions, thought of as that way. They're decisions because, as you said, Philadelphia has less money. Like they couldn't necessarily do that. But I think that then has this interesting relationship as to how you invest in your local landscape, and could you do it in a way that's been better than the past in sort of producing this unevenness? Could you actually kind of build on the ground wealth? I think it remains to be seen whether that's going to happen, but
yeah, and also the former goals of wanting to be like the most sustainable and greenest city in the country, which is like, all right, on paper that sounds nice, but what does that mean in reality? And wanting for every resident to be within a mile of a park, or not even a mile, like not half a mile or a quarter of a mile away from a park, those very important and but yet also ambitious goals that in reality, it's a different thing to actually just implement.
Yeah, and I mean, I think to understand that too, because also like there are other ways that people are dealing with land, but on a shorter term lease or a longer term lease, or all those questions around ownership and time also play into it. Cool. I think this discussion maybe leads us to Nathan and thinking about clean water.
It does, absolutely. Carlos, I'm so glad that you brought up combined sewer overflows, because I will talk your ear off now about CSOs in Massachusetts. And I love that you shared the example of Philadelphia, which I think really is a national, if not an international leader. And it's often held up as an example of what we should be doing in Massachusetts. So yeah, I'm excited to share some of my own work with you. And please do jump in anytime. Feel free to unmute, call out questions. Would love to make this a discussion. I'll talk about three things. One, I'll just briefly introduce myself and my background, explain how I got involved in some of these projects, and then I'll show you two case studies. The first case study is exactly what I was just talking about. It's building an environmental justice oriented data platform that helps, I designed to help with policy advocacy around combined sewer overflows in Massachusetts specifically. And the second is a more recent project, something I'm working on right now and getting ready to launch. So I'm excited to share it with you in advance. It's a new online platform for legislative engagement in Massachusetts that we hope will be part of how communities, especially EJ communities in the future, organize their advocacy to our legislature. Okay, so I'll start with me. I've lived all around the country. I've been in Massachusetts for more than a decade now, and all of my current work and work for the last decade has really focused in MA. My background is in physics and astronomy. I was an astronomy major in undergrad. I did my PhD in astronomy. That's how I came out to Massachusetts, going to the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. And it was while I was in grad school that I got really interested in policy and environmental issues and environmental justice. I'd always been interested in those, but I didn't really understand how that interest could intersect with my kind of professional skills and specialization as a scientist. And so while I was at Harvard, I did the Rappaport Fellowship. So for those who joined us last Tuesday, we had a really fun crossover event with the current Rappaport Fellows. And that was a lot of fun for me to interact with the folks who are doing the fellowship now that played such a big role in my career when I did it. So I took the fellowship to the Massachusetts State House, worked with a fantastic state senator and state rep who were focused on environmental and water quality issues especially, and got connected with the Mystic River Watershed Association, a regional clean waters group, which I've continued to work with for the past decade on a lot of the work that I'll share. So since I finished my PhD, I've been working mostly in industry on things that are not specifically environmentally focused. So I spent about 8 years in the entertainment industry doing data science at Legendary and Warner Media. For the last 2 years, I've been at Flagship Pioneering, which is a biotech VC firm doing chemical machine learning for drug discovery. But I've maintained this focus and interest in environmental justice and always look for outlets, ways I can still stay involved in that. And so the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, which is my affiliation that brought me to this fellowship, is one way I found to do that. It's a fantastic group of people focused on all sorts of different aspects of the interaction between technology and law. And so my kind of angle on that is how we can use technology and data to empower advocates, particularly in the EJ space. So I'll talk about these two projects that I mentioned. The first one is using data to support EJ advocacy around sewage pollution in Massachusetts and using some of the same tools as a more general platform. So I'll start with a story. I'm going to use a story to illustrate the information gap that has existed for decades in Massachusetts around this problem of sewage pollution. So this is an article that was published in 2017, just a few years ago. It's actually about something that happened in my little town of North Andover, Massachusetts. One day we all woke up and there had been a storm that night, there had been a power outage, and we found out that our town's wastewater facility had discharged some amount of sewage into the big river near us, the Merrimack River. And this is a little bit concerning because this is a river that serves drinking water to 500,000 people. So you might imagine that having sewage, untreated sewage as a result of a power outage being dumped into this drinking water source is a problem, and we think it was. So at first they didn't have an estimate of how much was spilled, but eventually the number came out. The best estimate was about 8 million gallons of sewage. So there are several problems with how this happened. One is that no public notification was issued. This was reported in the press, and it was not reported by the wastewater plant operator. It was not reported by the government, and that's not unusual. And when the newspaper called the wastewater facility, they could not or would not verify that this had happened. The state agency in Massachusetts, the Department of Environmental Protection, would not or could not verify that this had happened. And let me add one more point to this. I'm curious, people feel free to, I would love if you unmuted and shouted out an answer. This was not the only time this happened in 2017. So I'm curious, how many times do you think a spill like this happens in this one river in a year? Once, twice, 5 times, 10 times?
I mean, I want to say when there are heavy rains, therefore
Anytime it rains.
spring and around fall, maybe multiple times, and
multiple
summer
times for sure. Definitely multiple times,
Right.
and you're absolutely right. More concentrated in the rainy months. I'll tell you this. This is a rough number because unfortunately there hasn't been disclosure and tracking in detail. But this spill represented about 2% of the annual sewage burden on this river. So on average, you could say something like this happens probably about 50 times a year in the Merrimack River. So this is actually not an unusual event at all. This is routine. This is basically like a weekly type of thing on average. But this one just happened to be noticed by the press. It just happened to make it into the newspapers. It happened to get a Boston Globe article. But if people understood that actually this is happening like every week, and actually it's documented and statistical analysis has shown that this is a real public health risk. People actually show up at the hospital more often when it rains in our watershed because the drinking water is being contaminated by the sewage overflows. We hope that people might be interested and concerned in this. So I got interested in this issue when I was a Rappaport Fellow at the State House. And I was doing a limited term fellowship there. I knew in my office knew we weren't going to be able to like galvanize a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project to close these outfalls and end this type of sewage pollution. So we tried to think of what could we do to have a substantive impact. And we landed on this issue of notification. Could we at least let the public know that this is happening? Could we mandate that this be disclosed so we could build public interest in solving the deeper issue? So starting in 2013, when I was a fellow, I drafted a bill with the representative and senator I worked with. We filed that bill and we've been advocating for it. We have been advocating for it ever since then. to fight for the right to know about sewage pollution in Massachusetts. So the first step I took on this is using QGIS, making some district by district maps that I took around to each office in the State House. And I said, here's your district, here's where there are CSO outfalls. And look, you can see this is a river that flows by a school in your district or a hospital in your district. We wanted to really make it tangible for them how this issue affected them and their constituents. In that first session, we got something like 100 co-sponsors of this bill, which you would think might lead to immediate change and interest, but did not. This was a long battle. Part of what I did after I finished the fellowship is I tried to think about how to broaden our coalition. You know, we had a lot of legislative interest. All the environmental groups and watershed groups in the state eagerly signed on. This became a #1 priority of our statewide rivers group and was for many legislative sessions. But we wanted to think about how to broaden interest. And one way that we thought to do that is by pointing out that this is not just a public health issue. It's not just that anyone in the state might be at risk from this type of pollution, but actually specifically it's an environmental justice issue. Specifically, we believe this type of sewage pollution would overburden EJ communities, vulnerable communities based on where it's happening. So we sought out to prove that. So I did this statistical analysis that took the one data set we had access to in the absence of systematic tracking that gave us information about how much sewage was being discharged and where those discharges were. And we built a statistical analysis that compared that amount of discharge to EJ indicators. So we showed, for example, if you look at racial demographics, it should be the case that it doesn't matter where you live, how much your pollution burden is. You know, in a just society, it wouldn't matter if you were part of a disproportionately non-white community. It wouldn't change how much pollution you're exposed to. But in reality, we found that if you're in a watershed that has twice as much sewage pollution twice as high a rate of non-white residents as another watershed, you're likely to have 4 times as much sewage pollution. So there's a huge disproportionate impact. So the way we did this analysis is that we actually built this integrated data platform that pulled together a bunch of data resources from the state and federal government to allow us to do this analysis and hopefully to allow others to do similar analysis, this kind of disparate impacts analysis for other types of pollution, other data sets in the future. So we built this totally open source platform called AMEND, the Archive of Massachusetts Environmental Data. We integrated a bunch of state and federal data sets that are relevant to these questions. It strikes me when I show you this small list of data resources, this is, you know, a fraction of what's in something like Data Commons. It does not compare, but they're data sets that are really specific, really bespoke to Massachusetts. And we saw value in integrating those. And to my knowledge, there really hasn't been a lot of research or academic or advocacy work doing data analysis on top of some of these state level data sets in the past. The website has an interactive query form where you can actually interact with this data directly or download it. But maybe most interestingly, we've developed a variety of analyses using the data. So the one I'll focus on exclusively today is the CSO, environmental justice analysis. But we also have an analysis of changing patterns in state funding and staffing of our environmental agencies and how that's affected enforcement and other things over time. So I will do a quick demo. I'll try not to take too long, but I wanted to be able to show a little bit about what the website looks like. So this is all actually hosted on GitHub. It's hosted entirely for free using GitHub's Pages service. It's built using Jekyll, which is a static HTML compiler. So you write basically a little bit of HTML code, and Jekyll does the rest of transforming that into a full web page. And you actually don't need to write a lot of HTML. It's actually mostly Markdown. It's a markup language. It's the same thing you use if you're editing Wikipedia or using a WordPress editor. So let me go specifically to the analysis on CSO discharges, which I've preloaded here. This has a bunch of interactive maps that show you, for example, the volume of discharge in different municipalities or different watersheds across the state. You can click on each CSO and get a little bit of information about it. This is all done using Leaflet, which is actually the same technology that Jonathan showed us that's integrated with Glue and some of the visualizations he can help us build. Have the same information for racial demographics, linguistic isolation, and low income status. Those are our three state mandated EJ indicators in Massachusetts. And then we have the aggregated analysis. So just doing the computation per watershed or per municipality. How much sewage discharge is there? How does that compare to the EJ demographic indicators for those watersheds? So the watershed I focus on, the Mystic River, happens to be #2 in our state. Here we go. Number two, in terms of linguistic isolation, as a very large immigrant community in towns like Everett, Revere, and Chelsea, and also quite high on the fraction of people who are low income and non-white. Okay, and then we have the statistical analysis here. So this is an interactive graphic that will show you each individual watershed and where it shows up with respect to its EJ indicator and the volume of sewage discharge. And then we have a statistical analysis that shows you the trend across the watersheds and extracts, automatically extracts these statistics like the one I showed in my slide about having 4 times the level of sewage discharge. Okay. How do I continue presenting? Here we go. All right, so this is a success story in that we actually passed this bill. It took us 8 years, but it is now law that in Massachusetts, you have the right to know when sewage is discharged into a river. So now we're caught up with most other states that already had this. And that was, a huge milestone for our waters community here. It's I think a pretty good notification law, requires public notification within 2 hours, requires follow-up with an estimate of the total discharge, requires signage to be installed at outfalls that actually explain to people that this is happening. But for me, one of the most interesting things is that we've mandated the state has to create a website. It has to create an integrated database of all these discharge events going forward. So in the future, I won't have to use this one 10-year-old data set that a bunch of reporters put together by calling each wastewater facility in the state. In the future, I can actually integrate real-time reported data from the state about where these discharges are happening. And hopefully we can map out how this problem improves over time, how we lessen disproportionate impact of vulnerable communities. So I'm interested in extending this work now that we have this new data resource coming online. I want to understand what makes a government data portal successful. How do you go from just in ensuring that the data is reported to ensuring that people actually use it, to make sure the government actually tells people about it, engages people to use the data resource, and to inspire people to actually make use of it and use it in their advocacy and policy development work. So I've done some review of the literature on open government data, trying to understand how people assess what works and what doesn't work for these type of open data platforms. One thing I'm really interested in is the difference between transparency and collaborative outcomes. So a lot of these platforms are motivated by just getting the information out there, just disclosing, just telling people that this is, this form of pollution, for example, is happening. And that is a goal for us too. But I'm even more interested in collaborative uses. So for example, people actually using the data to make policy decisions, people actually having conversations about the data. And one thing that's been commented on in reviews of the space is that oftentimes those collaborative use cases are left out of analysis of the purpose and impact of government data platforms. So in Massachusetts, we actually have a great case study to study the impact of data platforms. Our state environmental agency actually launched its own data portal about 5 years ago. So we're now one of about 15 states that have a dedicated portal for environmental data. And I think that's, now that it's 5 years on, I think it's a phenomenal time to look back and see what impacts it's had and how we can improve it. Especially because just in the past month, this data portal now includes that CSO discharge data I was talking about a moment ago. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So I've started, but I'm very, very early in doing a kind of comparative analysis of our state data portal and making recommendations about how to improve it. One thing I'm really interested in is this framework for thinking about how data is used in the public space called data collaboration. So this is sort of an alternative to thinking of the data for good model that a lot of that myself and I think a lot of others in this field have been sort of brought up with. The main difference is that data for collaboration is all about empowering disempowered communities. It's about transferring knowledge and building social infrastructure, and it's not just about serving communities using data or helping them or finding conclusions on their behalf. So I'm interested in how open data portals can fit in this data collaboration model. And so the first step I've taken here is just doing a census of where the Massachusetts data portal is being used today. So just literally Googling for all references to our data portal, figuring out where it's being used and who is using it. And one of the things I immediately thought was interesting is that there are so many use cases today that are focused on transparency. So I think the number one example is like real estate websites that will link to the site information about that facility on the Massachusetts data portal. And that's great, for someone who's specifically interested in having disclosure about that one particular property. That's clearly very useful. But there are very few examples that I've found so far of this data portal being used for these collaborative applications, including analysis and policy development. So I'm interested in calling out ways to improve that. Okay, I'm going to try and go quickly through my second case study. I'm going to drag on Massachusetts more here. I think we're a wonderful state. We have many things to be proud of. Government transparency is not one of them. Massachusetts is notorious in the good governance community for having very poor legislative transparency, very poor government transparency. I believe we're the only state in the country that has a public records law, but actually exempts all three branches of our government from the public records law. So you might ask, why do we have a public records law? And I'm not sure. So in particular, I think there's a concrete thing that we can do to help this problem, because there have been years of legislative efforts to improve transparency in law, and those have failed again and again. But I think there's a grassroots way that we can have an impact on this, and that's by making the process for citizens and residents to engage with the legislature easier and more transparent. So today, if you want to have your voice heard in the legislative process, you would probably write out some written testimony, and then you would deliver it to the legislature. It's actually not easy to figure out how to do that. It's kind of an arcane process. You've got to figure out what committee a bill's in and who the chair of that committee is and what their staff person's email address is and when the hearing is, and you have to send in your testimony that way. And then once you do that, what happens is it goes into a black box and you never hear anything back, and you don't engage with other advocates who are communicating about this issue. And specifically, the legislature does not disclose what testimony they've received. They have exempted themselves from disclosing public comments as public information. And so at the end of the day, when a bill gets passed or doesn't, the legislature might say, oh, well, we heard from our constituents that this wasn't important or this was important, but there's actually no way for us to understand or check what information they've received. So we're trying to address this problem. I'm going to skip a little bit. I'm really inspired in particular by analysis work that was done at the Brown Climate and Development Lab about a 2021, a big climate omnibus bill that we passed in Massachusetts. I think there are a lot of good things in this bill, but they had a really remarkable analysis. They actually convinced committee staff to give them access to the written testimony for this one bill out of the committee. And they checked for each provision in the bill, who was pro, who was con, and what was the outcome. And what they found again and again is that public opinion was really substantially in favor, often like 100% in favor of stricter climate provisions. And there was one group on the other side, which, you know, to be frank with you, was a coalition of utility companies. And again, guess who the legislature sided with? The provisions ended up on the side of the utility companies. So, you know, this bill is already passed. This analysis did not change that outcome, but it generated a lot of media interest in reporting. And I think it really showed how we can hold the legislature accountable for environmental outcomes if we have access to the information that they're considering, and if we can point out what the public's consensus really is. Okay. So how to make progress on this? I'm also really inspired by academic models for sort of liberating information. So a lot of you who do academic publishing may know there's this huge migration towards open access content. And a big part of that was actually start with a grassroots effort. So it used to be the case that if you wanted to know the latest results in physics, for example, you would have to belong to a big, rich institution that pays thousands of dollars to a publisher and has a subscription through their library. And if you weren't part of a big institution, you just couldn't get access to that information. And then about, I think 25 years ago, a bunch of academics created something called the archive, which is just a preprint server. It's just a landing place where they ask scientists, would you share your work with us before you publish it? Would you just choose to make it free and available to everyone before the publishers get their hands on it? And at first, you know, it was kind of a curiosity and not many people used it. But within a few years, it became dominant. So now in my field in astronomy, 100% of papers are voluntarily published to the archive before they're submitted to a publisher. It's just universally used. And in many other fields, it's the same way. So the question was, could we do the same thing for legislative testimony? Can we build a platform that becomes a de facto standard where everyone opts in to choose to publish their testimony with us before or alongside sending it to the legislature and having legislative committees hear their voice? So through Code for Boston, which is a chapter of Code for America, this group of engineering volunteers, we have built this platform that we call MAPLE, the Massachusetts Platform for Legislative Engagement. It's an open source, volunteer run, free to use platform that is going to serve as a database of public testimony on bills in Massachusetts. So I'll just conclude by giving you a quick demo. This is our beta platform. We're launching in January, which is when the next legislative session starts, but we've got all the essential functionality pretty much here. We've got a lot of user education that shows you how to write effective testimony, what to do, what the legislative process is, what happens after you submit your testimony. And then the core features of our site are an integration of all the data from the legislature about the bills that they're considering. So we've built out this interactive search interface that gives you access to all the bills considered in the session. For each bill, you can leave your own testimony and also see all the testimony that others have already submitted. So we're launching this in January. At first, no one's going to have heard of it. We're trying to do a big publicity push so that people start using it right away. And we're hoping at some point, maybe within a few sessions, it'll become commonplace that people will choose to share their testimony here, and we'll have a new tool to hold the legislature accountable to public opinion. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you for hearing my spiel. If anyone has questions, I would love to address.
If folks don't mind, I can go first, just because I gotta go pick up my little one from daycare. I gotta leave very quickly. My apologies. So the maple thing is very cool, and if you want, I don't know, you obviously know a lot of people, but if you want to also consider other folks that are doing work at the state level, engaging with the state ledge, and if you want to, I can share this beta platform with folks just to get the word around. Just happy to do that. I just quickly wanted to talk about your first presentation on the CSO and sewage pollution issue in Massachusetts. I always ask myself, like, from at the national level standpoint. So a lot of the municipalities in the U.S. Are either under a consent decree or a consent order for not complying with Clean Water Act, and have a court mandated instructions on that they have like up to 25 years to retrofit their entire infrastructure to meet compliance. If not, they're going to pay hefty fines. And a lot of municipalities don't have that. Includes Philly, that includes San Juan, that includes New York, everywhere. Every place there's a CSO system has a consent order or a consent decree, which is worse, because like the court's saying you got to do this and you have no room for negotiation. And a lot of municipalities, they just don't have the funds to do the retrofits, even though they're forced by the federal government. Therefore, their time is running, and they're not going to meet their court order. And to face hefty fines by not complying means that some of the local municipality or local water authority can go bankrupt. And not having options to assess this in a better way, to make sure that we, like, all, as a country, we can move towards meeting compliance is a big issue. Because if there's a concern with bankruptcy from a lot of municipalities, then it's a slippery slope between bankruptcy and things like what happened in Detroit with the Fiscal Oversight Board, in basically the federal government taking ownership of local municipal governments and basically taking away people's rights, people's abilities through the finance oversight federal structure, taking away people's rights to elect their local officials and have them be accountable with their actions. So it's a big concern when there's a path between meeting environmental goals at the local level and not meeting them through the federal by meeting federal law or complying with federal law, that leading to losing rights or losing the ability of residents of a given municipality to hold their local elected officials accountable. We have seen that in Detroit. We have definitely seen that in Puerto Rico. So, and it is a problem that some conservative elected officials in federal level, Congress, are happy to have, because they're happy to then again move and say this municipality cannot handle its finances because they went bankrupt by trying to meet compliance with clean water or any other federally mandated law. Therefore, we are installing, we're putting on a federal oversight board, and they're making all of the decisions at the local level. So, just a concern on how something as important as meeting environmental compliance, the way it has been structured by the federal government, has, with experience with talking about Detroit, Puerto Rico, and other places, has led to people losing their rights, have led to more inequality and more injustices happening. And just a concern. So I guess what I'm trying to say is two things. How can we meet advanced compliance with clean water, which is really important, but do so in a way that it doesn't allow for conservative elected officials at the federal level to use that as an excuse to impose a different strategy that is more about control and less about people's rights and justice.
I think it's such an insightful point about loss of local control. I'm thinking too that that topic is dominating a lot of debate in Massachusetts right now with respect to education, as well as water management. I think those are such great questions. So first of all, our legislative strategy on sewer overflows here has really been focused on first building awareness and then building support for spending. So we know it's going to take billions of dollars that municipalities do not have to eliminate these combined sewer overflows. It's a legacy of centuries of infrastructure the way we would never build it in the 21st century. And it's the costs to remediate that are just exorbitant. So we know that we're only going to build public support for doing that if people are aware of, if they care about this issue. And so that's why we view the notification bill as the first step. Boston, or really the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority, the statewide water manager, has been under a consent decree for more than 2 decades now to address this problem. And they've actually made huge improvements. They've spent more than $1 billion eliminating combined sewer overflows, separating sewers to address this with gray infrastructure. And I think it's definitely made an impact. We're in a post-construction monitoring period now, so we're going to assess exactly what the impact has been. But unfortunately, for those of us who are advocates in 2021 and not in the 80s when this decree was sent out, we're not really happy with that outcome, because the design of the control plan was, I would say, not very equitable. There was, I think, demonstrably more spending in richer communities, like we'll just name some, Cambridge, for example, where Harvard is. There was less spending in poorer and less white communities, EJ communities. And so the targets for sewage reduction in those communities were lesser. And so if we meet those goals and the consent decree is satisfied, great, but we're still left with this problem. And as you say, Carlos, combined sewer flows actually are illegal nationwide under the Clean Water Act. And so what does it mean for a community to have met its goals for remediation, but then to still have millions of gallons a year of sewage being dumped, especially in EJ communities? So I don't know if we'll solve this problem, honestly, in decades. I think it's going to be a very long-term problem, at least for our state. But I think the only way to take a step towards solving it is building public interest so that we can get the money we need to spend to fix it.
Yeah, and I know I said a bunch of things that are multi-layered, but definitely meeting water compliance is of the utmost importance. Just highlighting with existing examples that sometimes when you have that federal mandate over a local municipality, and it's very hard for a municipality to meet that mandate, that we have examples in Detroit in which then the federal government chooses to take away people's rights because with the excuse that, hey, you can't comply with X amount of federal requirements and laws, therefore we're gonna, from a financial standpoint, we're gonna tell you what goes, what doesn't go. We're gonna force you to meet certain goals, and then all of a sudden you have a situation at the local level in which just people just lost their ability to elect officials that can do something and hold them accountable, and actually with the excuse of other things. So just trying to think about those connections as well.
I think you're absolutely right about that. I want to make sure to put an optimistic note in here. When I was in the State House, one common refrain is, how do we get the federal government to pay for this? And actually, we made progress on that because of the pandemic. All this money was distributed to states' ARPA funds. And actually, our state chose to allocate a few $100 million to sewage remediation. And that's the biggest investment our state has made in this in a couple decades. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to be spent yet. I don't think plans have been revealed. And it's only a small fraction. The total scale of the problem is estimated to be at tens of billions, not hundreds of millions. But it's a significant chunk. I hope other states are able to use those funds for similar benefits.
Thank you, Nathan. Amazing work. Thank you.
All right, I guess I will close us out. I'll try to go fast. Also, please feel free to interrupt me with any questions. So what am I presenting? All right. So I'm going to present two projects as well, both kind of collaborations. The first one is a collective I'm in called Design as Protest. And so the collective really came together around the 9 demands you see here. We are a collective of BIPOC planners, architects, landscape architects, graphic designers, people generally interested in the built environment. And so we kind of met online during the pandemic in 2020 when there was a lot of, after the murder of George Floyd, and just like kind of trying to take stock and understand like what is the built environment stake in racialized violence in the United States. And so we all signed on to these 9 demands and kind of use them as a guide to organize around within the design profession. So I think today this might be interesting to think about in comparison to the other things that we've seen today. This is like a very profession oriented or like industry oriented project. So I'll kind of go through what we've been working on since 2020. So yeah, again, these are kind of 9 demands, our kind of guide forward. As a collective, we are completely distributed. So there's about 35 to 40 of us around the country. I think it's pretty interesting to see like it's a full range of ages, industries, and backgrounds. And so I think I've learned a lot just from other people in a way that we didn't like start from one place. So this is just a snapshot of like how cute we are in the like, collective. But really the project I want to share today is what was kind of our first big one, was really kind of us taking on, so what, right? Like it was 2020, a lot of architecture firms, a lot of design schools were really talking about like, how do we meet the moment? What does it mean to be anti-racist in our institutions? What does diversity, equity, and inclusion look like in our institutions? There were a lot of promises made, but we wanted to actually figure out how, like similar to Nathan, like how you actually move towards action. And so these are just like our mirror boards and how we started thinking about the tangible steps needed. And so we categorize things in a few ways, which also I think the categories might be helpful. We kind of separated it into four kind of industry types. So practices like actual architecture firms, organizations, which I think is probably the most similar to the fellowship, academic institutions themselves, and then local governments. So thinking about the RFP process. Along with that, we thought about the kind of range of actions, right? Moving from just basic acknowledgement of the kind of, racist past, specifically in the United States, but we organize around North America, moving towards like, what does radicality look like? What does actual systemic change look like in terms of influence? And so, yeah, and then we have the direction of moving from just a basic equality, very standard, like having everyone have a seat at the table, to what liberation can look like for new educational models and labor, and thinking about what a liberated built environment looks like. So we kind of go from basically understanding the status quo to liberation throughout the index itself. And so this is kind of our online form of the index. I think it's interesting. We did both a print form and an online form. So the interface and the decisions we made for both of those is also something to kind of think about. But this is our really simple website. And so basically we have, divided them, and then we have subcategories of all the topics. And again, going from equality to liberation. And it's really simple code on Squarespace, where actually you can just like leaf down the tabs to understand what actions you can take. And it's a matrix to show that when you start with one thing, you can then kind of progress over time and over buy-in, and build towards more substantial actions. And so like I said earlier, there is kind of an online component. There's a website that I can drop in. But also we made a newspaper And I think the newspaper is a really good example of like how we set the groundwork for it. So we told the history of ourselves. We said why we're grounded by the demands. We had the actual index itself in its full form. And then we think about how to actually implement it. And it's also, I think, important to tell like, this is where the stories met the actions. So the index was a very like data-driven process about like how you move from one to another, but we also wanted to make sure people know like our voice, why we started organizing, who it affects, and how we imagine the future when these actions are implemented. So the kind of newspaper has been, you know, since we like printed it, has been a really great way to exchange conversations about it, to kind of leave and have people sit on the incredibly like rich, dense information we had, and can think about it kind of over time. And so it's a really good conversation starter. I think too, obviously with any digital form, there's just a lot of people that are left out right now, right? Like we can engage with other populations that maybe don't have access or don't feel as comfortable on computers, with a kind of physical form as well, which is also why we wanted to do that. So yeah, that first project, I went through it pretty fast. So if you have questions, let me know. But yeah, that was a project of about, I would say 15 of us over probably 6 months to kind of get to the index itself. And then the design of the newspaper and the writing of the newspaper was another about 6 months of it. So just to give you like a time sense and scale of like kind of what that endeavor was. And it's also something we feel like we can kind of update over time as well, which is cool. So this is our like version 1 of it. And then the other thing I wanted to show you, which is funny that I'm showing you digitally, is a completely physical project, but I just wanted to show you a kind of different way to approach data. So me and my collaborator and like best friend made these tufted maps last summer. We got a grant to make them because we wanted to tell the story of a city through different senses, right? I feel like we all understand and are pretty fluent in Google Maps at this point, but we wanted to understand how you could tell a story through, color and touch. And again, I try to engage different audiences. So we were really imagining this as a way to teach younger kids about the built environment. And so the mapping itself, and you can see how we use the data. These are like kind of precipitation floods in the area. On the left is the final kind of version of the data digitally. We projected it onto these very large frames and then tufted it. So like how you make carpets or like tufted, we used a machine. Each rug took about 100 hours in total. And we used a bunch of different notation devices to tell the story of the data. So the colors represent land use. We have the redlining information to understand the environmental use. And the story we really wanted to tell with the rugs, my collaborator is from Cambridge. And so we mapped out, 3 neighborhoods in the Boston area, 1 being Cambridge, and tell the story of like, basically just like the historic Black neighborhoods of the area. She felt it was really important to not just, I feel like with a lot of environmental justice stories, it's a story of disinvestment and redlining being wholly negative. And so we wanted to have it as an accurate representation of where past and current Black residents live in the area. But also try to understand if there are like moments of celebration or even just like moments of like, not quite solidarity, but just existence, right? And so trying to engage, different ways to kind of understand that. So yeah, what you're seeing is the colors are land use. There's corresponding colors that talk about what's vulnerable to flooding in the future. So we wanted to, like, as you, if you like squint your eyes, the areas that like look wetter are the areas that are vulnerable to flooding. So we wanted people to kind of understand that as well, to see if there's a connection with the redlined areas, and then access to tree canopy in general. So this is something that we tried for the first time. And so we're still kind of working through it as a method. But yeah, I just wanted to show like another way to tell a story. I think through a map, a lot of people are working through maps, and so different forms of representation. So yeah, I will end it there. Yeah, I think the maps too were a way to think about how public engagement could be expanded. We find that because they're fuzzy, people like to touch them in a way that like a lot of public facing information feels very institutional. We wanted it to be like shockingly different. So people wanted to engage with it. So we found like people ask more questions about it, I think, than if we just had like a big printout of the same data.
Would you consider sort of tutorials or inviting people to make maps with the tufting guns, or?
Yeah, there's a bit of a steep learning curve for like a tufting gun, but I think definitely like we're going to be in the Boston Public Library in December, which like, I don't know, maybe TBD with us as well as a cohort, but I think there definitely is something to, you know, telling the story of your neighborhood or where you live through different materials. So I think there's like some medium form of like not a professional rug that you could actually use, but like using materials to understand surfaces and land use.
Yeah, like more of a punch and hook or something, but yeah.
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah.
I definitely noticed that there are tufting studios popping up in Boston where you can like learn how to tuft, and it's such a big phenomenon on TikTok and all these viral mediums. I can see how this could be like a tool that's like really widespread and has impact because people love fuzzy rugs.
You could read your newspaper on them. They both, I feel like the newspaper is also quite tactile and awesome.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know if that's just because my like background is just design, but I just always prefer like a physical artifact. And so I think thinking about ways to translate the data into physical and then back to digital is really cool. Obviously, you can't update a physical object the same way you can update anything online. So I think that's the biggest limitation maybe of it. But yeah.
I'm a very, very amateur fiber artist, so I very much appreciate. Yeah, I mean, it's just a beautiful piece of art in itself, but just how it can become, you know, a story, and also, you know, yeah, like how everyone said, how it's so engaging. But I think that's kind of wonderful how you can't really change it as much, because I think in so many forms it's so easy for things to be erased. And even, you know, even like paintings, you know what I mean? Like how easy it is to just change the surface of things. But I think that's something special about fiber arts, is how they are a little more permanent in a sense.
Awesome. Should we conclude there?
I think so. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for joining.